Iria, the young heiress of a powerful family, ran desperately through the desert, the wind and sand whipping at her face. Alongside Yaiza, a nomadic man with sun-weathered skin, she faced the harshness of nature, determined to escape the chains of her destiny. In the midst of the relentless sandstorm, the love and freedom they shared defied not only religion and race, but everything the world had imposed upon them. The golden dunes rose like frozen waves under the burning sky, which seemed to lean down to kiss the earth. Every movement of the camel resonated with the solemnity of the desert, as if both the animal and the man were part of the same poem written by the wind. Yaiza Saif al-Falahi, mounted on his camel, moved forward with the calm of someone who has lived their entire life beneath the immensity of the dunes. His figure, wrapped in a white linen tobe and a gutra falling softly over his face like sand, was the very image of stillness. His gaze, fixed on the horizon, reflected an unshakable serenity, although deep in his eyes, a spark of reflection shone. A falcon crossed the burning sky with majestic elegance, its shadow slicing through the dunes like a needle-piercing time. Yaiza watched it, thinking. Even the freest creatures need a point of return, he thought, for freedom without purpose is nothing but aimless flight. As he continued, something disturbed Yaiza's serenity. In the distance, a figure began to take shape, stumbling between the dunes. It was a woman, dressed in a black abaya, fluttering in the wind as if the desert itself conspired to capture her. Yaiza's heart stopped for a moment, and his thoughts transformed into an involuntary whisper. "Is it an oasis or a mirage?" With a slight pull on the reins, the camel stopped, exhaling softly. Yaiza squinted, trying to discern whether this vision was real or the product of the scorching heat clouding his weary mind. But the more he looked, the clearer the figure became. The woman appeared real, though her staggering walk and the weariness etched into her silhouette gave her an ethereal, almost unreal air. When Yaiza drew closer, the figure defined itself before him. She was a beautiful young woman, covered in dust, with a loose hijab that revealed long strands of hair tangled by the wind. Her steps were clumsy, but her determination was evident. The desert sand covered everyone equally, erasing the differences between those who walked upon it. Yet a person's determination always shines through, even under the dust of exhaustion. Yaiza tugged again on the reins, halting the camel beside her. From his elevated position, he called with a firm yet warm voice. "Who are you?" he asked, the gravity in his tone softened by concern. "What are you doing here, alone?" The woman lifted her gaze, and her eyes, dark as the desert night, glistened with a mix of fear and determination. Her voice was weak, but it contained an unexpected firmness. "I'm someone who has nowhere else to go." The wind blew fiercely, lifting sandstorms around them, making the desert's loneliness even more tangible. Yaiza crossed his arms, his thoughts trying to decipher the mystery before him. He knew no one crossed the desert on foot without a powerful reason. "This place is not for the unprepared," he said, pointing to the vast dunes surrounding them. "Are you running from something?" The woman hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, her voice trembling as she replied, "I'm running from a fate I didn't choose." Yaiza felt those words cut deep into his chest. Despite the advancements of his land, there were still traditions that could be both roots and chains. Silently he watched her, seeing how she could barely hold herself up. "Get on the camel," he ordered, his tone firm, not allowing for debate. She looked at him with suspicion, her lips pressed tightly as though doubting the intentions of this stranger. "This desert doesn't forgive anyone, but I can help you," Yaiza exclaimed, extending his hand patiently. Something in his presence calmed the storms the young woman carried within. Finally, with a sigh of surrender, she accepted his help. The delicacy of her gesture, the way she allowed herself to be guided, suggested a deep vulnerability, but also an inner strength that had yet to be fully revealed. Yaiza helped her mount the camel, her body tense from the mistrust still hanging between them, but also from the urgent need for refuge. The camel resumed its pace, their tracks fading in the sand behind them. As they moved forward in silence, the sun began to sink into the horizon, painting the sky in golden and red hues, as if the desert itself were celebrating this unexpected meeting. The wind, soft and persistent, caressed their faces, bringing with it a sense of new hope. Yaiza knew this journey, which had begun as nothing more than a trek across the vast solitude of the desert, was now taking an unexpected turn. Perhaps he thought there was something deeper that connected them, something even the dunes could not separate. Iria clung to the camel with the same determination with which she had crossed the dunes. The desert air, warm and harsh, struck her face, carrying away the last traces of the security she had felt when she was at home. As they moved farther away from the place where her previous life had been left behind, a feeling of uprootedness overtook her. Her life, until that moment, had been marked by luxury and the protection of a powerful family. But now, in this vast sea of sand, everything seemed distant, almost unreal. This place was a completely new world, a world where everything she had known was crumbling. Yaiza, by her side, moved calmly, her posture upright and serene. There was something in her presence that gave Iria confidence, but also a strange unease. The desert did not forgive the weak, and Iria realized that she not only had to face the harshness of nature, but also the deep cultural differences that separated her from this world. "Where are we, Yaiza?" Iria asked softly, her gaze lost in the golden horizon that seemed to stretch endlessly. Yaiza, without looking back, replied in a firm tone, "We're in the Rub al-Khali, the desert of desolations. Here, life is measured in endurance. But don't fear, Iria. This desert has a wisdom that few understand, and I will guide you." Iria nodded, though she couldn't help feeling that everything she knew was being tested. The scorching sun and the relentless wind made her feel smaller than ever. Yaiza's clothes, her words, and her bearing, all of it spoke of a life completely different from hers. He was a man of the desert, a man who understood the language of the sand, the wind, and the sky, while she was just beginning to understand her own emotions in this new environment.
The camel moved slowly, but the silence around them was thick, as if the desert were watching them, waiting to see if Iria would withstand the weight of her destiny.
With each step, the reality of the desert enveloped her more. The winds, heavy with sand, seemed to whisper between the dunes, and the sun fell like a weight upon her shoulders. She realized she had entered a world where the rules were different, where life was not taken for granted, but had to be earned with each breath. As they advanced, Iria observed with a mixture of wonder and confusion. In the distance, a small village stood in the midst of the vast nothingness. Adobe houses, thatched with palm, lined a narrow, dusty path. Children ran barefoot through the streets, their skin bronzed by the sun. The people passing by, with weathered faces and deep gazes, seemed as foreign to her world as she did to theirs. The contrast was so strong that Iria couldn't help but feel like a stranger, as if somehow her arrival in the desert was marked by the difference between her pale skin and the bronzed skin of the locals. In a corner, an elderly Bedouin with a wrinkled face knelt, reciting a quiet prayer to the wind, as if the words were merging with the air and the dunes themselves. Iria didn't understand the language, but she could sense the reverence in his gestures, the devotion in his gaze. Everything seemed to have a deep meaning, something beyond what she had learned in her previous life. "This is a world where Islam is not just a faith, it's a way of life," Yaiza said, noticing Iria's curious gaze. "Here, every man, every woman, lives for and by Allah. There is no space for doubt or for betraying what one believes." Iria felt as if a heavy weight had fallen upon her shoulders. Islam, which had always been a distant religion in her life of luxury, took on a new dimension here, in the heart of the desert. It was a lived, breathed faith, not just in words but in every action, in every breath. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red and orange, as the shadows of the desert stretched out, drawing mysterious shapes in the sand. Yaiza stopped the camel and dismounted with agility, helping Iria down as well.
"Come, follow me. Here, in this place you will find what you are searching for," she said, pointing to a small tent beside a natural spring.
Iria followed her, her mind still confused by the intensity of what she had just witnessed. They entered the tent, which was decorated with brightly colored carpets and cushions scattered across the floor. In the center, an oil lamp flickered softly, illuminating Yaiza's face, which appeared calm and serene. "This is the world we now share, Iria," she said, gazing at the lamp. "Here, no one judges you by the color of your skin or your origin. We are all equal before Allah. Iria sat in front of her, absorbed in her words, but she couldn't help but notice the difference between them, the difference in their skin, in their world, in their beliefs. It was an abyssal difference, a gap that seemed impossible to bridge. Yet, something in Yaiza's words, something in the peace that emanated from her presence, gave her a glimmer of hope. As night descended upon them, the silence of the desert enveloped them, and Iria realized that she had arrived at a place where differences were not just visible, but were what defined who they were, who we all were. In this world, the desert not only marked the land, but also marked the soul, shaping the identity of those who crossed it. What you see here is not just a refuge for the lost, Iria. It is a place where everything you thought you were can disappear. Here, people live according to the law of Allah with dignity, with honor, and with the will to live in peace with the world and with oneself, Yaiza said, breaking the silence. Iria nodded, wordlessly. She knew that in this desert, in this foreign world, she would begin to understand not only Islam, but also true freedom, a freedom that did not come from things, but from faith, courage, and the ability to accept what life brought her. That night, as the wind whispered through the dunes, Iria realized that she had crossed not just the physical desert, but a threshold into a completely different future. And although the differences between her and the world around her were still vast, in her heart something was beginning to change. The night slowly descended upon the desert, tinting the dunes a deep blue. The air cooled after the intense heat of the day, but the absolute silence surrounding the tent was even heavier than the heat. Iria sat in front of the fire, her eyes fixed on the flames that danced like little mirrors of the soul, reflecting the confusion and fear that still lingered within her. Beside her, Yaiza maintained a calm posture, as if the peace of the desert had rooted itself in him, giving him strength. There was something in his presence that conveyed serenity, something that Iria, despite her reservations, couldn't help but admire. There was something in the air, in that corner of the world, that seemed to make words unnecessary. The wind continued to blow, but in the tent, only a whisper from the dunes filtered through the cracks. The firelight dimly illuminated their faces, Yaiza's serene, almost unshakable, and Iria's marked by fatigue and uncertainty. "It's difficult, isn't it?" Yaiza suddenly said, her voice soft but filled with understanding. Iria looked up at him, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't just referring to the difficulties of the journey, but to the weight of life in this unfamiliar desert. The differences, the cultural clashes, the new rules, all seemed to collapse onto her in an overwhelming way. "Yes, it's..." Iria began to speak, but her words were lost in the air. She looked at the flames, searching for something in them to help order her thoughts. "I never imagined I'd end up here." Yaiza nodded slowly, his gaze lost in the fire.
It's a place that tests much more than the body, Iria. The desert is not just sand, wind, and sun. Here, people face their soul, confront what they cannot avoid.
Iria nodded, but didn't respond. It was a struggle that felt too large, too deep. She felt that she needed to adapt not just to the heat, but to the very essence of this world. A world of people who lived according to norms and beliefs that seemed foreign to her. At that moment, a figure emerged from the shadows, an unexpected presence that broke the silence. It was an old man with a wrinkled face, a long white beard that fell to his chest as if woven from the very threads of time. His eyes were small but penetrating, full of a wisdom that seemed as ancient as the desert itself. The man carried a wooden staff in his hand, worn and curved, as if time had shaped its form as much as it had shaped the man himself. He walked with deliberate slowness, each step taken with the certainty of one who knows that time doesn't run, it flows. Yaiza looked up, and a slight smile appeared on her lips.
The elder has arrived, she said, with a softness that contrasted with the hardness of her words.
Iria turned toward him, surprised by the man's presence, who was now approaching the fire, leaving behind a trail of sand that slipped away like the memory of his passing.
This is Grandfather Ahmad, Yaiza continued, standing to greet the man with a respectful bow. He has lived more than any of us can imagine. The desert is his home, his life, and perhaps his teacher as well.
Grandfather Ahmad sat beside the fire with slow movements, allowing his staff to rest beside him. His eyes fixed on Iria, observing her with an intensity that seemed to read her soul, as if each glance was a lesson imparted by the winds of the desert. Iria, though somewhat unsettled by the elder's penetrating gaze, couldn't help but feel drawn to his serenity. There was something in him that seemed to understand, something that conveyed a sense of peace she couldn't find anywhere else.
"How do you feel, young one?" asked Grandfather Ahmad in a deep voice, but full of a softness only years could bestow.
Iria looked at him, feeling the weight of his gaze enveloping her. She wasn't sure whether she should speak or remain silent.
"I'm lost," she finally replied, her voice trembling. "I never imagined my life would bring me to a place like this."
Grandfather Ahmad nodded slowly, his eyes shining with a light that seemed to come from deep within the desert. "Here, we are all lost at some point. The desert does not forgive, but it does not forget either." He paused, gazing into the fire with concentration. "The desert asks you to leave behind what doesn't belong to you, what no longer serves you. And only when you do that will you find your way." Iria looked at him, confused but intrigued. His words resonated in her mind, but she still didn't fully understand their meaning. The elder seemed to know more than she was capable of understanding, as if time itself had revealed secrets to him that others couldn't yet grasp. "The desert is a harsh teacher, but a good one. It strips away the superficial, what doesn't matter, and leaves you with the essential," continued Grandfather Ahmad, now looking at Iria with a penetrating gaze. "Do you know what the essential is?" Iria felt the weight of the question but didn't know how to respond. She wasn't sure what she was searching for, what she needed to find in this vast, barren world.
"The essential is what makes you human," Yaiza said, interrupting the silence that had taken over the air. "The desert forces you to see yourself, to confront your soul."
Grandfather Ahmad smiled, a gesture almost imperceptible that illuminated his weathered face. "Well said, child. The essential is what makes you truly live." Iria remained silent, reflecting on their words. The fire, crackling softly in front of her, seemed to offer more than just warmth. In it, she saw a kind of mirror, reflecting not only her face, but also the emotions still struggling to find their place. The wind blew strongly, lifting small whirlwinds of sand around them, as if the desert itself were listening and approving the words of the wise men. Iria closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. She knew there was something beyond the sand, the wind, the fatigue she felt in her bones. Something she needed to discover, something only the desert could teach her. And while Grandfather Ahmad and Yaiza conversed in low voices, Iria understood that perhaps she was beginning to find her place in this world that felt so foreign, but in some way was starting to feel like a part of herself. The old man, with a face weathered by years and the relentless sun of the desert, lowered his head and studied the bird carefully. His movements were slow but deliberate, as if time in the desert had no rush. With a serenity that only years could grant, he nodded after a long moment.
"The desert never abandons those who fight," he said in a deep, measured voice. "Come to the fire. Here we will find what it needs."
The old man began to crush dry herbs in a small stone bowl, while the scent of the burned leaves mingled with the cold night air. Iria watched in silence, captivated by the precision of the man's movements, by the way he seemed to have all the time in the world, as if life itself were a cycle that must be fully respected. Finally, the old man lifted his gaze and cast a look full of wisdom at Iria. "This hawk is wounded but not defeated. What it needs most now is not strength, but patience," he said, as he applied a warm ointment to the bird's wounds with hands that were firm yet careful. The same patience the desert teaches those who cross it. Iria, sitting by the fire, gently stroked the hawk's feathers as the old man continued his work, absorbing every word he spoke as if they were lessons the desert itself had kept for centuries. The bird's fragility, having survived the harshness of the desert, reminded her of herself, of her struggle to escape her fate, to find a purpose in a world she did not fully understand.
"Do you think it will fly again?" Iria asked, a mixture of hope and fear in her voice, her words broken by emotion.
The old man smiled faintly, not pausing in his work, as if his wisdom were beyond any doubt or fear. "Flight is never lost forever, it is only forgotten. If we care for it, its body will remember what its spirit never stopped knowing. "How to soar in the sky," he said, his gaze lost in the flames of the fire, as if the words he had spoken were part of an ancient spell only the desert could understand. He paused, his eyes fixed on the bird, before continuing. "Each wound carries the memory of the struggle, and in that memory hides the key to rebirth. The same applies to the hawk and to us." Yaiza, who had been watching in silence, impressed by the old man's calm and wisdom, couldn't help but speak. "Why are you doing this? You don't know us, and you have nothing to gain," he asked, genuinely curious. The old man looked up at him, his eyes reflecting an almost infinite calm. It seemed as if everything he had lived through was contained in that gaze, one that did not require quick answers. "Because caring is not a duty, but a privilege," he replied slowly. "Whoever saves a life, no matter how small, saves a reflection of themselves." The power of those words filled the air like a fresh breeze, and Iria understood, for the first time since arriving in the desert, that there was something greater at play than her own suffering. Caring, healing, was not just done for others, but also for oneself. The old man then pointed toward a corner of the camp where a small, modest yet well-maintained tent stood against the starry sky. The fire continued to burn brightly, casting warm shadows over the camp. Iria, watching the dance of the flames, felt strangely connected to this world, so foreign and yet so full of life lessons. The elder, with his infinite calm, had prepared a simple stew, but the aroma was so comforting that it seemed to give the night a profound meaning. The humble ingredients, like lentils and dates, seemed to come alive in his hands, blending with the desert air. As Grandfather Ahmad distributed the bowls of stew, Iria stood up, determined to help. She approached the women who had gathered near the fire, a group that had been working all day to prepare the camp. Without saying a word, she began to share the food with them, her hands moving with delicacy but with a new confidence that had started to bloom within her. The atmosphere was filled with soft laughter and murmurs of gratitude as each person received their portion of the stew. The wind blew, carrying a bit of sand, but that did not seem to disturb the spirits of those sharing the meal. Everything was tinted by the warm light of the fire, which illuminated the smiling faces of the Bedouins as if they were floating in an atmosphere of peace. There were no luxuries, no opulence, but there was something more valuable, human warmth and a deep respect for the present. Iria, her hands still trembling but her heart full of gratitude, passed the bowl to a small child who looked at her with wide, dark eyes. His mother, a woman with a sun-weathered face, smiled softly, grateful for the gesture. Iria felt touched by that smile, something she had never experienced in her former life. It wasn't just about giving food, but sharing something much deeper, the sense of community, of belonging, and the tacit understanding that each one of them, in their own way, was responsible for the survival of the other. As the fire lit up the scene, Iria observed the faces of the others. The women, with their sun and wind-tanned skin, leaned toward the fire, talking and laughing, while the men conversed quietly among themselves, some of them looking at Iria with curiosity, but without judgment. The material poverty that surrounded them did not seem to affect the lightness of their hearts. The desert had shaped them, but it had not broken them. In their eyes shone an unbreakable strength, a joy that did not depend on what one had, but on what one shared. Iria sat next to Yaiza, and they silently watched the others share the food, grateful, enjoying each other's company. Grandfather Ahmad, who had been silent all this time, now broke the silence with his deep voice. "Here, the desert teaches us that true wealth is not in what we possess, but in what we give," he said, looking at everyone gathered around the fire. "Every act of generosity is a reflection of the soul. It doesn't matter what we lack. What matters is what we are capable of giving." The old man's words lingered in the air, like a blessing spoken in the heart of the desert. Iria, as she handed a clay bowl to an older man with a wrinkled face, felt a deep peace within her. These people, although they lived with the bare minimum, knew how to appreciate what they had, what they shared. As the last shadows of the night fell over them, the laughter and voices continued to fill the air. The glow of the fire illuminated the faces of the Bedouins, with wide smiles reflecting not only satisfaction from the food, but from life itself. The harshness of the desert remained a challenge, but it had not extinguished the spark of humanity that united them. Iria looked at Yaiza, whose eyes, as always, were fixed on the fire. There was something in her serenity that calmed Iria, something that made her feel that despite the difficulties of their circumstances and the uncertain future, here, in this corner of the desert, there was a community that shared much more than a meal. They shared their existence, their struggle, and their hope. "This is a good place to learn," Yaiza said, breaking the silence as she observed the others. Iria nodded, but did not respond. She knew many challenges lay ahead, but she also understood that in this small camp, under the desert stars, there was something she could never have found in her former life. A deep sense of belonging, a sense of purpose that went beyond herself. The night continued its course, with the fire crackling, the laughter resonating, and the vast, eternal desert silently observing the small act of humanity unfolding at its center. In that moment, Iria understood that the desert not only taught them to survive, but to live with dignity and hope, despite all that the world could take from them. The first days in the desert were difficult for Iria. Although the cool morning air brought a breath of fresh air after the scorching heat of the afternoon, every moment seemed to be filled with new challenges she had never anticipated. Yaiza, however, seemed to move with the same ease as the wind that caressed the dunes, patiently teaching her everything she needed to know to survive in this vast and arid place. Every morning before the sun rose too high, Yaiza woke her early. While most of the women in her former home were still asleep in their luxurious beds, Iria was already up, beneath the stars of the desert, learning to identify constellations, to understand the winds, to recognize animal tracks, and how to navigate in the vast expanse of sand that stretched as far as the eye could see.
"The desert has its own language," Yaiza told her one day as they walked under the rising sun. "If you learn to listen, it will speak to you. Don't listen with your ears, but with your heart."
Iria gazed at Yaiza in awe as he taught her to read the signs of the desert, as if everything she had learned in her past life was nothing more than a grain of sand compared to what she was learning now. Each day was a deeper lesson about nature and herself. It was as if the desert stripped her of everything superficial, forcing her to confront her own vulnerability. Yaiza showed her how to find water in the desert, how to build a temporary shelter in the most effective way, how to navigate without a map, how to use the wind and the stars as natural compasses. Iria began to feel that, for the first time in her life, she was truly connected to the earth, the sky, the essence of existence. There was a freedom in all of this, a freedom she had never felt in the opulent halls of her former home. Here, there were no expectations, no appearances, no people judging her. Only the present moment existed, and that feeling of authenticity slowly filled her. But although life in the desert taught her the freedom of survival, the freedom of nature's purity, there was something else she could not ignore. Every time she looked at Yaiza, she saw something that challenged everything she had learned about her previous world. His skin, darker than hers, was different, just like his eyes, which shone with a wisdom that sometimes seemed foreign to her. Yet, in those eyes, Iria also saw a reflection of herself, as if through him, she could understand her own struggles and fears. Iria couldn't help but notice how the people living in the desert, so different from what she had imagined about Arabs, Muslims, or people with darker skin, lived in complete harmony with the land. In her former life, she had only seen them through stereotypes, through the distance imposed by her parents, her education, and society. To Iria, Arabs were always distant figures, and in many cases mysterious. Muslims, a religion she saw as foreign and far away, and people with darker skin like Yaiza were often seen as being subjugated by fate, condemned to live in the shadows of a social system that oppressed them. But here, in this world without labels or judgments, she began to understand something deeper. The people of the desert were not a preconceived image. They were people with generous hearts, with deep wisdom, with a faith that they lived through every action, through every gesture. She no longer saw Yaiza as the Arab man, the Muslim, or the man with dark skin. She saw him as Yaiza, a human being who had offered her help when she needed it the most. A man who had a connection to the desert that went beyond his skin, his religion, or his origins. As the days went by, Iria began to break the walls of thought that had been carefully built in her mind. She no longer felt the same disconnection as before, no longer looked at the dark-skinned women and men of the desert with eyes full of prejudice. Instead, She saw human beings, fighters, survivors, equal to her in their vulnerability and strength. One day, while resting by a small oasis, Iria approached Yaiza, who was preparing water. She couldn't help it. She felt there was something more in her heart, something she could no longer ignore. Every time she looked at him, she felt a mix of admiration and something else, something she couldn't identify, but that made her heart beat faster. "Yaiza," she said, her voice trembling. How do you do it?" Yaiza looked up, his eyes warm but enigmatic, as if he already knew what she wanted to ask. "Do it," he repeated with a slight smile. "I do what the desert has taught me. Listen, respect, and don't judge. The desert has no prejudices. Here, it doesn't matter where you come from, or the color of your skin, or the beliefs you carry with you. What matters is how you live in the moment, how you face what the desert gives you." Iria looked at him in silence, feeling that his words pierced something very deep inside her. Slowly, she realized that Yaiza was not just teaching her to survive, but also to live. As the days went on, Iria began to see beyond the differences, beyond the categories that society had imposed. She and Yaiza became companions in life, united by something more than the desert, by something greater than their origins, their skin color, or their beliefs. There was something growing between them, a silent understanding that didn't need to be verbalized, a deep connection that defied all the social conventions she had learned. It was a strange, new, and powerful feeling, something that told her that maybe love was not found in predictable places, but in places where one dares to see beyond appearances. And with each passing day, Iria delved deeper into that world that, although different, was beginning to be hers too. The desert storm had arrived suddenly, as if the sky itself had decided to strip the earth of its calm. The wind rose with fury, dragging with it the sand that struck the walls of the tent and the ground. Iria, huddled close to the fire, couldn't stop thinking about the storm that roared not only outside, but also within her heart. The rain, which rarely fell in the desert, seemed to bring with it a new perspective, a feeling of urgency that drove her to finally speak of what had been tormenting her for so long. Yaiza, sitting near her, watched the fire, but his mind was as focused on the young woman as the desert was with every breeze that passed through it. Iria didn't know where to start. For days, she had been battling a fear that paralyzed her, a fear that, though hard to admit, had begun to overshadow her during the quietest moments. The fear of being judged. Finally, after a long silence, Iria broke the stillness of the night, her voice soft but heavy with an emotional weight that was hard to bear.
"Yaiza,
She said, tension evident in her tone.
I'm scared."
Yaiza looked at her without taking his eyes off the fire, as if he already knew what she was going to say, but he said nothing. Iria swallowed before continuing, as if her words might make them even heavier in the air. "I'm afraid of what others think." Her eyes filled with uncertainty as she spoke. I know we're far from everything, but the truth is, I can't stop thinking about what my family would say if they knew I lived here, with you." Yaiza remained silent, and the sound of the storm continued to fill the air. Iria could feel the weight of her fear making her smaller. It wasn't just about the desert or the journey she had undertaken. It was about everything she had left behind, everything she had learned and lived in a world where the differences of race and class were unbreakable walls. "My family, my father," Iria said with a bitter laugh. "They would never allow—" She stopped, knowing that the words, though already a reflection of her thoughts, were harder to say than they seemed. "They would see me as a traitor. My people have always taught that people like you, like us, shouldn't mix. And I'm afraid the world will reject me, tell me that what I'm doing is wrong, just because I'm here with someone like you." The words hung in the air, and Iria couldn't take her eyes off the fire, which seemed to reflect her restless soul. Yaiza, eyes fixed on her, said nothing immediately. For a long moment, silence took over the tent, only interrupted by the distant sound of the storm. Finally, he spoke, his voice deep and serene, filled with a wisdom that seemed to transcend words. "Iria," he began, his tone unhurried, as if the words were carefully chosen. "What you fear is not the rejection of others, but your own fear of facing what you really feel. And I understand you, but true freedom does not lie in what the world thinks of us, but in what we decide to believe about ourselves. Iria looked at him, her eyes clouded with confusion and pain. Yaiza continued, his words calm but powerful. The desert, like life, has no place for appearances. Here, it doesn't matter what you are or where you come from. The desert only accepts those who cross it with a naked soul, without fears, without prejudices. You can't let the gaze of others define what you are or what you do. True freedom is in freeing yourself from those thoughts. True freedom is knowing that it doesn't matter what others think, as long as you feel at peace with what you do. Iria stayed silent, deeply reflecting on Yaiza's words. But it wasn't easy. She knew she couldn't simply discard years of education, of prejudices, of family expectations that had been so deeply rooted in her. Her life had been dictated by strict social norms, by the image her family and society in general had of her as a young woman from a powerful family, a princess of the Rosario lineage, who was supposed to behave according to the unwritten rules of the elite. But what Yaiza told her resonated deeply within her. Iria had traveled to many places, and during her travels to the United States, she had witnessed the racial discrimination that existed in many places. She had seen up close how Black people were treated as second-class citizens, how society had been built on the false superiority of white people that relegated others to the margins. She had had friends, wonderful people like Jordi, a young Egyptian man she had met during her stay at university, but even so, every time she visited him at his house, her family watched her with disapproval. Her travels, though filled with beautiful moments, were always interrupted by her family's judgment. The rigidity of her lineage, the behavioral rules of an aristocratic family, didn't allow her to be truly free. "I remember Jordi," she murmured, unable to help it. "He was my friend, Yaiza. And when I went to visit him, my family kept asking why I was wasting my time with someone like him. In the end, they forbid me from going to his house. They say that Egyptians aren't people like us, that they don't belong to the circle of decent people." Yaiza looked at her in silence, as if he perfectly understood what Iria was feeling. He said nothing immediately, but his eyes conveyed a deep understanding. "That's what the world has taught you, Iria, but it's not what the desert will teach you. Here, there is no place for categories, for judgments. Here, only the value of your heart matters, what you truly are inside. The desert sees no colors, no classes, no religions. The desert only sees the human being. And you, like everyone else, are a human being with dignity, with the right to decide for yourself without the prejudices of others dictating your life." Iria felt a kind of liberation in his words, as if a weight was slowly lifting from her chest. In the distance, the wind carried away the last drops of the storm, and the firelight seemed to envelop her in a sense of warmth, of acceptance. Yaiza was right. True freedom did not lie in what others thought or said, but in what one chose to believe for oneself. She looked at Yaiza, her eyes now clear and determined. "What if everything I've learned is wrong?" she asked quietly. "Then, Iria, it will be time to learn what really matters," Yaiza replied with a calm smile, his gaze filled with an understanding that only time and experience could grant. "The important thing is that now you are choosing your path, not what others expect, but what you feel. And that is the first step toward true freedom." Iria nodded slowly, with the certainty that, although the road ahead would be difficult, something inside her had begun to change. Something within her had begun to question what she thought she knew about herself, about her place in the world. And in that moment, in that desert and solitary place, she felt for the first time that she could be free. The desert wind blew fiercely that night, taking with it the last vestige of peace Iria had found in her life. Yaiza and Iria were sitting near the fire, as always, the warmth of the flames alleviating the coolness the desert brought at night. However, today there was something different in the air. A forewarning that Iria could not ignore. It was as if the wind, the same one she had seen from afar in her past life, carried with it something she didn't want to hear. Suddenly, her mind was invaded by the memory of her family. In her heart, love and duty were trapped in a battle that had been raging inside her since she made the decision to flee. There was something about loyalty to her family, the responsibility she felt as part of the Rosario lineage, that she had never been able to fully reject. Her father, Gerardo Rosario, a man of firm principles but deeply loving, had done the impossible to protect her, even when the rules of their family imposed a destiny she had never chosen. Despite her father's love, Iria knew that the powerful Rosario family would not allow her to escape. Her marriage, like many others within the family, had been a strategy, a matter of securing the power and economic interest of the dynasty built over generations. The marriage her father had arranged with Mikkel, a man much older than her, was not just a union of two people, but a strategic alliance to strengthen the family empire even further. But deep in her heart, Iria knew that her father, although a man of principles, had always loved her. And that love was the reason why, despite everything she had done, he had decided to break the family rules to protect her. Before her family sent men to search for her, Gerardo had managed to send a message to Yaiza, warning them of the arrival of the men sent to bring her back. Iria, sitting silently beside Yaiza, thought of those words written by her father. "Run, Iria. Do it now before it's too late. I love you more than words can express. My duty is to you and to what is right, not to the interests of our family. Run, my daughter. Run as far as you can." The message had arrived just in time. Her father's warning, filled with desperation and love, had given them the chance to escape. Now, the fear that had grown in her chest since she started fleeing was materializing with the imminent arrival of the men from her family.
Yaiza,
Iria said, her voice trembling, staring intently at the flames of the fire.
"My father loves me, I know that, but he can't do anything against my family. He can't face them all."
Yaiza looked at her in silence, with a deep understanding that only the desert could offer. He knew what it meant to be part of a powerful family, one that considered honor and tradition more important than individual happiness. The struggle Iria faced wasn't just a conflict of love and duty, but a fight against a system beyond her control. Even her own father, despite his love for her, was trapped in a web of family interests and obligations.
"I know, Iria," Yaiza said softly. "Your father's love for you is greater than any family obligation. He wouldn't have sent you that message if it weren't true. But now it's time to decide. What will you do with the freedom he gave you?"
Iria, feeling the weight of his words, fell silent, but her eyes shone with a determination she hadn't had before. Though she feared the consequences, she knew she could not turn back. She could no longer return to a life where her voice had no power, where her heart could not decide for itself. Yet fear still lurked in her mind, the fear of what her family would do when they discovered she had left for good. Soon, the men from her family arrived at the camp. Iria saw them approach from a distance, their silhouettes outlined against the horizon, with the setting sun behind them. The sound of their horses galloping over the sand reached her like an echo, like a death sentence for her freedom. "We have to go now," Yaiza said, quickly rising. His normally calm and serene face was marked by palpable tension. It wasn't just about protecting Iria now, it was also about fighting everything that family represented, everything Iria had left behind. Yaiza and Iria ran toward the camels, preparing to flee, but in their hearts, they knew the escape wouldn't be easy. The men of the Rosario family wouldn't stop until they found her, until they brought her back to her imposed destiny. The desert storm began to intensify, and the wind rose in fury, as if the desert itself were pushing them forward. The dunes slid and the sun dimmed, leaving only the darkness of the desert. "Let's go!" Yaiza shouted, giving Iria one last glance before mounting his camel. The sound of the hooves of the Rosario family's horses echoed in the distance, but Yaiza and Iria were already far away, disappearing into the vastness of the desert. The struggle that lay ahead wasn't just a flight. It was a battle against prejudices, against the social and racial barriers that had been imposed upon them, against a system that didn't understand the freedom they sought. In the darkness, under the starry desert sky, Iria began to understand something she had never fully grasped before. Her father, Gerardo Rosario, despite all the power of his family, had put his love for her above everything else. He had done what he thought was right, not for power or money, but for his daughter. And now, in the flight, in the silence of the storm, Iria understood what love truly meant. It wasn't about fulfilling others' expectations, nor about following rules that didn't align with her being. Love, in its purest form, meant being free, being true to oneself despite threats, despite differences, despite what the world could say. And as the desert enveloped them, Iria realized that her struggle had begun. But for the first time, she was not alone. And though the road would be long, in her heart, she knew that the freedom she sought was within reach, closer than she had ever imagined. The desert wind blew fiercely that night, sweeping the sand in a chaotic dance, as if the desert itself sought to strip them of all hope. Iria stood next to Yaiza, watching the flames crackling in the fire. The feeling of freedom, which had seemed so close only moments ago, began to fade in the face of a new reality. In her mind, the future was uncertain, filled with fears she could not yet name. "Yaiza," Iria finally said, breaking the heavy silence. Her voice trembled, but her gaze remained fixed on the flames, as if waiting for the answer to come from them. Yaiza looked at her without speaking for a moment, studying the glow in her eyes and the tension in her face. He knew what she was about to ask, the same question he had asked himself during endless nights in the desert. "Where do we go now?" Iria asked, her words heavy with uncertainty. Yaiza did not take his eyes off the fire, but his eyes reflected a determination that Iria could not ignore. He had already made a decision. Although escaping the desert had been just the first step, the journey now demanded something bigger, more risky, something neither of them could foresee, but that, deep down, both knew had to happen. "I think it's time to leave the desert," Yaiza said finally, his voice firm. "Here we protect ourselves, but we're also trapped. We've been running, but the world out there, outside this desert, might be what we need to start over." Iria frowned, feeling the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. The freedom she had found in the desert didn't seem so simple to transfer to another place. The desert, although cruel and barren, had been her refuge, her sanctuary from everything she knew. Now, what Yaiza proposed seemed like a leap into an unknown abyss. "But what if we don't find what we're looking for?"
she said, her voice trembling as her thoughts struggled to fit together. "What if out there, beyond the desert, we're met with more hatred and rejection? If the world outside the desert is worse than we fear, how will we face that?"
Yaiza looked at her steadily, and though his face remained calm, Iria could see a small crack of concern in his eyes. He knew his decision wasn't easy, but what the desert had taught them both was that running always meant losing something more. "We can't live in fear, Iria. Fear is what holds us back, what keeps us trapped in a cycle we didn't choose. The world out there has its own challenges, I know, but only by facing those difficulties can we find true freedom. If we stay here, in the desert, we'll never know if we can live outside it, if we're truly capable of deciding our own fate." Iria didn't respond, but inside she felt how fear embraced her, how her upbringing, her values, her family expectations haunted her, even though she didn't want to admit it. What if they were wrong? What if the prejudices of the outside world were stronger than the hope of finding a place where she could be free? Finally, after a long silence, Iria looked at Yaiza, her eyes now shining with a mixture of fear and determination. "Then let's go," she said with a sigh, her voice filled with a vulnerability Yaiza had learned to recognize. "Let's go to the city." Yaiza nodded, his eyes reflecting both relief and sadness. The journey they were about to begin would not only separate them from the desert, but also push them to face a new battle, a battle for freedom, for dignity, for who they chose to be. The journey to the city was long and dangerous. The scorching desert sun had been wearing them down little by little, but what awaited them beyond the dunes was even more terrifying to Iria than the journey itself. The city, this unknown place, seemed to call to them from the distance, but at the same time, it warned them of the dangers that lurked. The life they were leaving behind seemed so distant, but the future, filled with uncertainty, took their breath away. Finally, after days of travel, they arrived at the outskirts of the city. Iria paused for a moment before entering, gazing at the vast city stretching out before her. It was a world completely different from the desert, a place where people were pressed against each other, where the crowd seemed to forget those who moved on its margins. The streets were noisy, full of movement, but to Iria, everything seemed strange, foreign, incomprehensible. "Do you think we'll find what we're looking for here?" she asked, barely lifting her gaze to look at the towering structures around them. Yaiza didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around cautiously, like an animal that knows it's entered unfamiliar territory. He knew the city would present new challenges, but he also knew there was no turning back. We'll discover it together, he said calmly as he took her hand and they began walking toward the city center. The hustle and bustle of the city surrounded them, but Iria felt more alone than ever. The people, so different from her, walked quickly, not stopping to look at her. Despite the crowd, she felt invisible, as if her presence had no value in this world. The glances she crossed were fleeting, but she felt every one of them. With each step, she felt the differences between herself and others becoming more palpable. Suddenly, a group of men passed close by, casting quick glances at Iria and then at Yaiza. Iria, at first, ignored the whispers, but when she heard the word foreigner muttered with disdain, her heart skipped a beat. Here, in this world of light and shadows, she was an outsider, and everything she had been taught about racial difference materialized with a terrifying force.
Yaiza!
Iria whispered, her face paling. This is not what I thought. Here, I feel out of place. Like I don't belong in this world.
Yaiza looked at her, and though his eyes reflected the same determination, there was also sadness in them, a sadness for the hardships that still awaited them. Iria, the world out there is not easy, but if we face it together, we'll find a way to be in it. Here, in this city, prejudice is more visible, but it doesn't have to define us. Who we are is above what others choose to see in us. The tension soon exploded. In the market, as they walked through the crowds, a strong hand grabbed Iria's arm. Before she could react, she was dragged into a dark alley. Yaiza, seeing what was happening, immediately reacted, trying to reach her, but he was quickly surrounded by several armed men who, with unexpected brutality, shoved him into a group.
"Let her go!" Yaiza shouted, struggling as they held him, but the men pushed him to the ground.
Iria, terrified, was shoved into a windowless vehicle. The last thing she saw before being torn from her position was Yaiza, struggling to free himself from the kidnapper's grip. The darkness of the vehicle and the shouts of the men blended into a chaotic symphony as she tried to understand what was happening. At that moment, one of the kidnappers, with a covered face, approached her. "Don't worry, girl. We'll be out of here soon. Your destiny is already written." Panic seized Iria as her heart raced. Where were they taking them? What did they want from them? However, despite the desperation, Iria felt something inside her awakening. She knew she had to fight. On the plane, during the transit between destinations, taking advantage of a lapse in the guard's attention, Iria and Yaiza managed to escape. Quickly and cleverly, they slipped out of sight of the kidnappers, hiding among the shadows of the transport. Finally, during an emergency landing with the chaos, the heat of Cairo hit them as they stepped out of the airport. The bustling city, full of life and movement, greeted them with a mix of chaos and promises of the unknown. Iria looked around, still unable to fully process what had just happened. She had fled from her family, from the desert, and now, in a strange city, she felt that her life had taken a turn she couldn't predict. Yaiza walked beside her, her face determined, but uncertainty reflected in her eyes. Though her heart was still pounding from the escape and the fear that pursued them, something deep inside knew they had to move forward. Somehow they had to find a new beginning, but the most urgent matter was how to survive. They had no money, no job, and the gold that Yaiza had hidden in her clothes wouldn't last long. Iria looked at Yaiza, her voice tense. "What do we do now, Yaiza? We have nowhere to go. We have no money, and we know nothing about this city." Yaiza looked around, evaluating their options. At that moment, a man, a taxi driver in a worn shirt with a friendly smile, approached them.
"Where are you headed, friends?"
he asked, noticing the confusion on their faces. Yaiza hesitated for a moment. They had no one to turn to, but the taxi driver seemed sincere. They couldn't stay at the airport, and they had no idea where to go. Finally, Yaiza nodded.
"Take us to a safe place where we can rest, please,"
she said cautiously. The taxi driver nodded, and without asking any more questions, he drove them through the narrow streets of Cairo. As they moved, Iria gazed out the window, both fascinated and terrified by the city unfolding before her. The streets were filled with people, cars, motorcycles, street vendors. Everything seemed to move at a speed that overwhelmed her. Yet, despite the chaos, the warmth of the taxi driver and the way he spoke to them gave her a sense of comfort amid the disorder. After a long journey, they arrived at a quieter area, a small street where the buildings were old but full of life. The taxi driver dropped them off at a corner and pointed out where they could find shelter. Before leaving, he said with a kind smile, "You're safe here. The people in this area help outsiders. But if you need anything, a favor, don't hesitate to ask." Yaiza thanked the taxi driver and gave him a small sum of money for his help, though she knew it wouldn't last long. Looking at Iria, she thought about what they had to do next.
We need to find work, Iria, and fast. This money won't last long.
Iria nodded, but her gaze was still lost in the streets, feeling the weight of the city that wasn't waiting for them. After asking several merchants in the area, an older man with a sun-weathered face and a wise gaze told them that they could find what they needed at Cairo's old market near the area of the souks. According to him, there was a place where they could sell the gold that Yaiza had been hiding. With this new hope, Yaiza and Iria headed to the market, where the streets became a labyrinth of stalls, vendors of all kinds, and the unmistakable scent of spices in the air. They finally arrived at a small gold shop with display cases full of shiny jewelry that contrasted with the more humble surroundings. Upon entering, an older man with graying hair and a long beard watched them with a mix of curiosity and hospitality. Though the shop was modest, the objects inside seemed to have a great history, as if each piece of gold had traveled through generations. "What can I do for you?" the man asked in a warm voice as his weathered, experienced hands flipped through a ledger. Without hesitation, Yaiza took out the small gold ingot she had kept so carefully and placed it on the counter.
We need to sell this, she said sincerely, looking the man in the eye.
The man studied them carefully, evaluating the gold before raising his gaze to meet theirs. "It's good gold," he commented with a smile. "But more than that, I can see that you're not here for luxury, but for need. That's always noticeable." Yaiza and Iria exchanged a look, surprised by the man's honesty. "How much would you give us for it?" Yaiza asked. The man calculated quickly and then, with a firm decision, offered a price much higher than what Yaiza had expected. "Take this money, and not just that," he said, skillfully storing the gold. "If you're looking for work, I have a friend who needs help. In the old book market, there's a man looking for someone to help him catalog his ancient Arabic books. That could be what you need." Yaiza and Iria, amazed by the man's generosity, thanked him profusely.
Thank you so much, Iria said, still surprised at how quickly the pieces were falling into place.
The man smiled and gave them the direction to the bookshop. When they left the gold shop, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange. For the first time since they arrived in Cairo, Iria felt that maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to find their place in this chaos.
Arriving at the bookshop, a small place with shelves piled to the ceiling with ancient books, Yaiza and Iria entered, and the man who greeted them was an elderly man with graying hair and a deep gaze, as though each one of those books had a story to tell.
"Welcome," the man said in a soft but firm voice as he offered them a seat. "What brings you here?" Yaiza quickly explained their situation, and the man listened attentively. After a few moments of silence, the old man smiled with understanding. "The work I offer is not easy," he said. "But if you're willing to learn, I can teach you how to catalog the books. Many of these texts are ancient, of great value. It's not just about selling them, it's about preserving them so future generations can enjoy them." When Iria heard these words, she felt an instant connection with the old man. It wasn't just a job, it was a mission to protect history, a task full of purpose. "Thank you, sir. We accept gladly," Iria said, her voice full of gratitude. The old man nodded, his gaze warm and wise. "Good. I'll show you how to catalog them. This is a job with no rush, but remember, the value of the books isn't just in their price. The value is in the stories they hold. And if you ever feel that the stories are too much, remember that here, in this small refuge, we all share the burden of the past." Over the next few weeks, Iria and Yaiza worked with the old man, cataloging books, learning about the rich history of Arabic literature, and slowly finding their place in Cairo. The old man, though humble, was a wise man with a generous heart. Soon, Yaiza and Iria not only learned about the books, but also about the importance of preserving history and the lessons of the past. As life in the bookshop continued at its quiet pace, Iria and Yaiza realized that, although the city was tough and challenges continued, in this small corner of Cairo, they had found something they never imagined: a home. Not in the physical sense, but in the sense of belonging, being surrounded by people who accepted them for who they were, without prejudice, without judgment. Here, in this bookshop, they found a way to rebuild what they once thought they had lost.
And as the days went by, Iria and Yaiza began to understand something fundamental. Sometimes, destiny isn't about finding a place in the world, but about finding a place in the hearts of those who choose to see us without masks.
In the hustle and bustle of Cairo, Yaiza and Iria had found a peaceful and rewarding rhythm in their lives. Every day was a new opportunity to rebuild what had been lost, and although they were far from everything they knew, the small bookshop of the elderly Adnan had become a refuge of peace. Yaiza and Iria not only helped sort and sell old books, but had also made the space a place where human warmth prevailed over any obstacle. Iria, in particular, had found a new passion, cooking. Inspired by the nomadic recipes she had learned in the desert, she prepared simple but flavorful dishes for the elderly Adnan every day. The warmth of freshly baked bread, the aroma of spices mixed with tender meats, and sweets made from honey and dried fruits were her way of expressing gratitude to the man who had taken them in. "These are the best delicacies I've ever tasted in my life, daughter," the elderly Adnan would say with a smile, enjoying a plate of kabsa accompanied by spiced tea. "You have a gift for bringing the soul of the desert to the city." Yaiza and Iria also shared these delights with the neighbors and the market vendors. Each dish was received with smiles and thanks, and little by little, the community began to recognize them not as strangers, but as part of them. Life, though simple, was filled with small joys that made each day worth living. One afternoon, while Iria was organizing some books on the shelves, she noticed something unusual. A small boy, dressed in worn clothes, was standing in front of the shop door. He seemed nervous, as if debating whether to enter or leave. Iria watched him for a moment, intrigued by his behavior, and finally went outside to speak to him. "Hello, little one," she said softly, bending down to his level. "Do you need something?" The boy, no older than 8, lowered his gaze, fiddling with the hem of his shirt. His voice was barely a whisper when he responded, "No, I was just looking at the books. I like them, but I don't know how to read." Iria felt a pang in her heart. The boy, like so many others she had seen on the streets of Cairo, seemed to have been forgotten by the world, but he still held the spark of curiosity in his eyes.
"What's your name?" she asked with a kind smile.
"I'm Amir," the boy replied, looking up shyly. Iria invited him into the shop, where she showed him some picture books and talked to him about the importance of learning to read. Amir listened attentively, his eyes shining with a mixture of enthusiasm and longing. That evening, while having dinner with the elderly Adnan, Iria couldn't stop thinking about the boy. She finally shared her idea with Yaiza and the elderly man. "I want to do something for Amir and other children like him," she said with determination. "I want to teach them to read. We don't have much, but we can hold an outdoor class after the market closes." The elderly Adnan smiled, nodding slowly. "You're a special young woman, Iria. You have my full support. Books aren't just for selling, they're for opening minds." In the following days, Iria organized a small space near the shop, where every afternoon, after the market closed, she met with a growing group of street children. Using old books from the shop and makeshift chalkboards, she taught them letters, words, and the stories contained in the books. Amir was the first to arrive each day, always with a smile and contagious energy. Soon, other children followed him, and what began as a small outdoor class became a place of hope for the little ones who had never had the chance to learn. Yaiza, though she initially observed from a distance, soon joined in, helping to organize the materials and ensuring that the children had water and food. The days passed quickly, and Iria felt that, for the first time in a long time, she was making a real difference in the world. One evening, after closing the shop and having dinner with the elderly Adnan, Iria sat staring at the small lamp that lit the room. In her mind, an idea had been growing for days. Finally, she made a decision and reached for the phone Adnan had lent them. "Who will you call?" Yaiza asked, watching her with curiosity. "My father," Iria replied, a mix of nervousness and determination in her voice. "I need him to know I'm okay, and I want to know how he is." Yaiza nodded, understanding the importance of this moment. Iria dialed the number with trembling hands, and after a few seconds, The familiar voice of her father, Gerardo Rosario, answered on the other end of the line. "Iria," he said, disbelief and contained emotion in his voice.
Dad, it's me. I'm fine. I'm safe, she replied, feeling the tears begin to roll down her cheeks.
For several minutes, they spoke honestly. Gerardo told her how the family had gone through a difficult period after her departure, but he also shared surprising news. The Rosario family had decided not to go through with the agreement with the Gomez family, the powerful family Iria had been forced to marry into. That decision, though controversial, had proven to be the right one, as the project they were going to participate in ended up being a failure that would have cost millions. Sometimes, destiny works in mysterious ways, Gerardo sighed, but the most important thing is that you're okay. That's all that matters to me. Iria smiled, feeling an immense weight lift off her shoulders. Although there was still much to resolve, for the first time in a long time, she felt that she was on the right path. In the days that followed, Iria and Yaiza's life in Cairo was filled with a renewed sense of purpose. The small outdoor school grew, attracting the attention of more people in the market, and the elderly Adnan's shop became a community center, where knowledge, generosity, and hope intertwined. Every day was a reminder that, even in the darkest times, there is always an opportunity to start anew. And as Iria and Yaiza looked at the horizon from the shop's rooftop one night, they knew that the journey they had started together still had much to offer. The future, though uncertain, shone with a light they could not ignore. The soft sound of the bookstore bell rang out on the street, announcing someone's arrival. Yaiza and Iria, sitting in the old wooden chairs that had once belonged to the elderly Adnan, exchanged a quiet smile. Although time had left its marks on their faces, their love for life and for what they had built together had never been stronger. A few weeks ago, Iria had received a call from her father, Gerardo Rosario. His voice, though more tired than the last time they spoke, still carried the same concern and love. "Iria, daughter, are you okay?" he asked gently. "Are you coming back home to take over the family business? I've been thinking a lot about you, about what you left behind." Iria sighed, looking out the window of the small workshop where she now worked every day, teaching children, organizing reading workshops, and giving math and science classes to the youngest ones. Her life was no longer the same, and remembering the life she had left behind, something in her chest told her that she could never return to that world. "Dad, I can't come back. I can't go back to that life. I've found something bigger, something more important. I've found my purpose here." Iria took a deep breath, looking at Yaiza, who watched her with the same serenity she had always given her support. "I've been helping many children in Cairo, organizing classes for street kids. With the help of some people, I've already opened a small school." Her father was silent for a moment, as if processing what she was telling him. But when he spoke again, his voice was filled with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, daughter. I knew that one day your kindness and passion for helping others would take you to a better place, though I hadn't imagined it this way." Her father paused, then continued, this time with a firmer tone. "I'll send you some money, enough for you to open a bigger school, a place where children can learn, no matter where they come from. I want you to continue your work, my daughter. I want you to know that I'll always be here, supporting you." Iria felt a deep sense of gratitude upon hearing her father's words. Although she had left her home, her privileged life, and her family, she knew that her father's love had not changed. The connection between them, though different, was stronger than any obstacle. When the call ended, Iria and Yaiza shared a long, warm embrace. They, the two who had once been fugitives, were now at the forefront of a dream much bigger than they had ever imagined. The money sent by her father was used to open a school, a place filled with hope for orphaned and street children. Years passed, and Iria and Yaiza became beloved figures in the community. Though they never had biological children, in every child they helped, in every smile they earned, they felt that parenthood manifested in a much deeper and more meaningful way. It wasn't necessary to be biological mothers and fathers. In their lives, they became parents to many. Amir, the boy who had once been at the door of the bookstore, grew up to become a successful businessman. However, he never forgot the love and education he received from Iria and Yaiza. In his heart, they would always be his true family. One afternoon, as so many others, Iria and Yaiza sat in the old bookstore where it all began. The place, now cared for by them, was still the sanctuary it had once been for the elderly Adnan, who was no longer with them, but whose presence still lingered in every corner of the store. The scent of old books, of pages that still preserved the history and soul of their owner, filled the air. "Do you see it, Yaiza?" Iria said with a soft smile, looking at the shelves filled with books. "I never imagined it would end up like this. Everything we've done, everything we've lived, has brought us here." Yaiza nodded, looking around with a mix of satisfaction and reflection. They had done more than just survive. They had changed lives, not only those of the children they had taught to read, but their own as well. They had found something much bigger than the physical freedom they had sought when fleeing from the desert. They had found a purpose and a home in the hearts of all those they helped. What I never understood when we were fleeing, Iria, is that the desert, the escape, the separation, it all brought us here. It wasn't just the place we were escaping to, it was the door to a life full of meaning, Yaiza said, her voice filled with emotion. Iria looked at Yaiza, her eyes shining with the tenderness that only time and shared experiences could create. "It wasn't the escape that changed us, it was what we decided to do with our freedom," she replied. They looked together out the window, where the lights of Cairo began to shine as night fell. In the distance, children played around the school they had created, their laughter filling the air like a melody telling them that it had all been worth it. And as they watched that scene, they understood something fundamental. True happiness does not lie in what we possess, but in what we share with others. Human love, kindness, and generosity among people will always be more powerful than any division, any prejudice, or social norm. The future was no longer uncertain. It was full of promises, of laughter, of books, and of lives that kept changing thanks to a life dedicated to helping others. And so, with hearts full of gratitude, Iria and Yaiza moved forward, being parents not only to the children they educated, but to all those who shared with them the vision of a more just and loving world. They never imagined that the love they gave to others would be the greatest legacy they could leave.